thinking will defrag your mind of propaganda-ridden viruses induced by mass media news programming. No BS here, just the facts.
And now we present to you America's quintessential iconoclastic anomaly. Wow. In talk radio, your host, Joe Cristiano.
Liberty Talk Radio, America's libertarian voice, broadcasting from our studio in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to around the world. I'm your host, Joe Cristiano, and this is your antidote to popular talk radio. Folks, it's time for us to take back control of our government now before this bureaucratic, oversized, and self-serving federal government starves us of our property, our freedom, our rights, our liberty. But to do this, we must shed conventional thinking regarding our political structure. We need to be revolutionaries in thought, dissidents in action. Only after we recognize what our government is doing to our freedom and our Constitution will we start taking it back. And this program is just about that. Today we are pleased and honored to have as a returning guest Mr. Michael Brady. Michael is an former intelligence officer, and now a professor of intelligence and security studies at the Citadel. Today we'll be discussing foreign policy. What really is our role, if any, in foreign policy, and if we are now with our new president, President Trump, whether or not we're going in the right direction. And I'm just curious as all heck as to what Michael has to say. Michael, welcome back to Liberty Talk Radio.
Joe, thanks a lot, buddy. It's an honor to be back here again with you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Well, nothing riles me more than foreign policy, because I'm sort of a constitutionalist in a way, not an expert, but I mean, I've been around it long enough and spoke to so many people who are experts in the Constitution, probably like yourself. And when you study the Constitution and you realize what our founding fathers had intended, I mean, they were pleased as punch that we were protected from all of the European mess, the European shenanigans going on between the countries. And the same thing with the Far East, because we were protected by the Atlantic Pond and the Pacific Pond, and can be our own people and leave everyone alone. And as my mother used to tell my father when he used to rant all the time about what's going on in the world, my mother used to say these words. She'd say, Victor, if people would only stay home and mind their own business, the world would be a better place. Why can't President Trump understand those words? Please, Michael, shed some words for me.
Well, I agree with you, and your mother was a very smart woman. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. And I think what we're starting to see here in about the first 6 or 7 months of the Trump presidency is just yet another example of misguided foreign policy and how we use our elements of national power. We have a lot of tools in our kit bag, so to speak, to address foreign policy issues. We do have military options, and as you and I have discussed many times, we use them far too frequently. But we have economic options, we have diplomatic options, and I think the problem that I'm starting to see now, as I saw in previous administrations, is that when we start to run into some of these foreign policy challenges, some of these issues, our first inclination is to do what? That is to use the United States military to try to solve the problem.
Right.
And as you know, and as your audience knows, the United States military can solve some problems, but the vast majority of these foreign policy issues that we're dealing with are not solvable through military force.
Yeah, it's like a bad marriage. Every time the husband feels that the wife is not agreeing with him, he just beats the hell out of her, and that solves the problem. And it seems like we have a bad marriage with the world. I just don't understand the zombieized mentality of the American citizen. It's that we've been totally brainwashed, and we talked about this last week a little bit with John Whitehead of the Rutherford Institute, and we talked about how all the movies that we've seen, The Matrix, Star Wars, George Orwell, 1984, all of these are metaphors for our future, and our future is here now. I mean, I have and when I have a conversation, and I avoid them these days, with anyone, for example, should women serve in the military and be given rifles? And I say, absolutely they should, but they shouldn't go overseas. If anyone would invade us, everyone gets a rifle. Even my 5-year-old grandson gets a rifle. But no, we don't give him a rifle to go overseas to kill people, because if someone invaded us unjustifiably, everyone's in the military, Even if you have a pacifier in your mouth, give them a knife, I mean, everyone's in the military. But that was the intent, I believe, from my perspective, what the intent of our founding fathers were, is that we leave everyone alone, but should someone unjustifiably invade us, everyone's on board. But you never hear this. And when I mention this in a business meeting or in a conference of some sort, people look at me like I've lost my mind, that this guy needs drugs, get him out of here. Yeah. So please help my sanity.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think one of the problems is that whenever we have a threat, or what we perceive as a threat, oftentimes what I've seen is that we have a fundamental misunderstanding of that threat and how it will truly impact the United States of America. And I think that's what you're talking about. When you're talking about the founding fathers, I think in the Constitution it says that we have a right to defend ourselves. And where that gets a little fuzzy is, how do you defend yourself? Do you wait for an adversary or a threat to reach the shore? Or, as what we've seen in the last couple of decades, do you confront that threat overseas? And I think that's the significant challenge that many of our politicians have right now. Because, for example, when we talk about North Korea, when I sit there and I say, okay, North Korea, they fired off some missiles. They've done 12 tests so far this year. They just launched an intermediate range ballistic missile in July. And you have half of Congress, or actually many more than that, talking about how this is a threat to Alaska and a threat to California. But if you sit back and you look at the telemetry data, and you look at their capability with their missile program, and you look at their incapability of miniaturizing a nuclear warhead, our citizens in Alaska and in California and across the United States of America are safe. It's not a threat. On top of that, you have a THAAD system, and we just had a test the other day, off the coast of Alaska, proving that the technology works. So you've got this constant struggle in Washington, D.C., that whenever there's a problem or a perceived problem, the playbook says send in the U.S. military or solve the problem. And, that's one of the challenges that we have going forward, and that is, how do you defend the United States of America? Does that mean waiting for an attack to hit, or does that mean taking the initiative? And I think oftentimes that's where we get fuzzy, and it becomes difficult to delineate between the two. Because I agree with you, we have too many military forces deployed. We are involved in too many foreign policy issues right now, but it's because of that perception that if we don't do something overseas, that it will eventually find its way back. And that's the problem that you have trying to convince politicians to use a prudent course of action.
Yeah, I looked up, for example, the size of North Korea. North Korea is just almost exactly 2/3 the size of the state of Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma is by far not the largest state in the United States. It's one of the smallest states. It's an average-sized state, I guess. But it's only 2/3 the size. And North Korea is thousands of miles away. Why? I mean, to me, it's ludicrous. Why are we even concerned about it? And now, maybe South Korea should be concerned about it. Although, if we took our troops out of South Korea, in my opinion, and left South Korea to discuss things with North Korea, there would be some sort of more of a harmonious relationship without us there. We are keeping that wall up between both of them. And Seoul is right on the North Korean border. If the fight breaks out, everyone dies. There's no, the whole thing is insane. A friend of mine moved to Iceland recently. He says, I like it there. He says, although you have long long winter nights and, long summer days and whatever and whatever. He says, but no one goes to war in Iceland. Iceland is never going to war. Well, I said, well, why not? I mean, they can be threatened. They can be taken over by someone else. How come they're not invading everyone? Well, obviously I was being facetious, but why don't... would it not be? We don't understand human nature. That's our problem. And I think the military-industrial complex forces us to take the actions we do because that's where the money is and that's where the power is. And it doesn't rest with you and I, unfortunately. But Ed, please.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And the other problem is we don't understand what the motivations and intentions are of these adversaries. Which really drives me bananas as a former intel officer because it was my job to try to understand what the enemy or the competitor is trying to do. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned North Korea again. It's funny because I actually have an op-ed piece right now that's being edited. It should come out tomorrow or the next day where I have made the case to withdraw from South Korea over the next 10 to 15 years. I don't think we need to be there anymore. We can argue whether or not the mission was righteous in 1950 when we countered the North Koreans invading South Korea, which they got support from Russia and China. We can argue whether that was good or bad. But the reality is we've been there now for 6 decades. The Cold War is over. If we were to leave, I don't think North Korea would attack South Korea. Number one, they don't have the capability militarily to do it. And number two, I quite frankly don't believe that China would do it. The problem, though, is that we as Americans and many in Washington believe, well, nobody else can solve the problem. We'll just solve the problem. We'll keep the soldiers there. If Kim Jong-un fires off a missile, we'll deploy a carrier strike group and we'll talk tough and we'll threaten missiles. It's insanity. And so, that's an article that I got coming out here, hopefully in the next day or two, once the editor is done with it. But I agree with you. We should be leaving South Korea. Not immediately. I think that would be a mistake. But I think if we started to withdraw our forces over the next 10 to 15 years and asked genuinely from China to take the leadership in the Koreas, I think that's the way to go.
But isn't basically the leaders in North Korea, aren't they following our playbook? Anytime there is some sort of internal conflict overseas, we send aircraft carriers to show our strength behind one side or the other. This is what we do, and they're doing the same thing, but we just don't like it when they do it. Only we can do it. And to me, that's so disingenuous. If I was a foreigner looking at the United States, I would look at our country with total disgust.
Right. No, I agree with you. I mean, the playbook that the North Koreans are using is right out of the U.S. handbook. One of the reasons why they've increased the frequency of testing, particularly over the last couple of years, is because they are trying to test the technology to ensure that it works. But I agree with you. That playbook that the North Koreans are adopting is coming right out of the U.S. playbook. Anytime there's tension, we either deploy military forces or we suggest the use of military forces, and they're going to continue to do the same thing. Until we look at the situation holistically and we ask ourselves, do we need to be there? What will happen if we withdraw? I think we'd come to the conclusion that the Chinese could handle the problem, all right, and that we have the capability to defend ourselves, particularly with a robust ballistic missile defense system that we have. And it was just tested again the other day. It works. I am not worried about a North Korean ICBM hitting the United States in the next 3 to 5 years. It doesn't worry me because, number one, they can't do it. And number two, if I'm wrong and they were to be able to do it, we'd knock it out of the sky. I'm convinced of that.
Oh, yeah. I don't think a missile would ever get, several miles away from North Korea before it got knocked out. I mean, we have too many.
Yeah, we do have THAAD deployed forward in South Korea. True.
Absolutely. And of course, I feel I can rest assured at night. I can sleep well at night because we still have 50,000 troops in Japan.
Right.
Whew, boy, I feel good about that.
Right.
Well, I'm going to say something that's going to sound totally insane. If North Korea wanted to build a missile, the way I think, I would sell them the parts.
Right.
I would make them dependent on us, and I'd make money on the deal. Now,
well, I'd have to disagree with you on that one respectfully, but
I'm sorry.
I said I'd have to disagree on that a little bit, but I understand.
You understand what I'm saying? I probably would. But I mean, if we sold them the parts and we showed them how to make it, they're going to bomb us. They're going to need our parts for it. I mean, but in other words, we should do everything we do. We should do to complement other countries and not antagonize them. And all we do is antagonize them. But why do we spend so much airtime on mainstream zombie television on North Korea? Why do we spend any time? It's smaller than the state of Oklahoma.
Right. Well, it's fear. Fear sells. Fear is entertainment. I mean, if you can put on a caption on the TV that talks about, North Korea threatens the United States or threatens Alaska, a lot of people are going to look at that. They're going to want to tune in. They're going to want to learn a little bit more. And so, it's what I've been writing about the last few months over the summer. It's what I've talked about. It's a hyped threat. All right. It's good for ratings, Joe. It's good for the audience, that they can be entertained when you have some of these people on there, trying to make us scared and make us worried about North Korea's ability to defend itself. It's nonsense. It's just not a proven technology. They're still years away. But the other thing is, remember what we talked about a few months ago, I think it was our first or second show, if we don't have a threat, we can't sell certain technology to the South Koreans.
Right.
Okay? We've sold them billions and billions and billions of dollars over the last few decades. It's a money-making proposition for the U.S. government. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but the reality is that if we have a threat on the Korean Peninsula, what happens? Not only do we have the ability to sell technology and weapon systems to other nations in the region, we also can go back to Congress and justify higher appropriations. That's what this is about. There's no other way to say it. It's this military-industrial complex, and it is robust when it comes to the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, I guess the old saying goes, follow the money. Wherever the money is, that's where you go. And there's money, there's money in crime, there's money in drugs. That's why they keep in my opinion, the war on drugs going. There's money in drugs. If you legalize it, a dose of heroin would cost you about the same as a dose of an aspirin. There's no money in it. So
and think about what would happen if we went and pursued the following strategy. All right, North Korea gets about 90% of its economy from China. 90% of its trade comes from China. Now, could you imagine if we would just sit back for a moment, come up with thoughtful foreign policy, convince the Chinese that it's in their best interest, along with our interest, to denuclearize the North? They could do it. We could figure it out. But nobody, from what I can tell from the news cycle, is doing this. I know that President Trump talked to President Xi a few months ago. I'm sure they've talked by phone. But I see no serious consideration given to letting the Chinese solve the problem. Now, Trump did come out and tweet about 6 weeks ago and said, I gave China a chance and, thanks for the help, or whatever the heck he said. That wasn't long enough. This stuff takes months, if not years, to resolve. Yeah. And it's our impatience. And again, now we're back to, deploying carrier strike groups and trying to solve the problem militarily. It's just not going to work.
People voted for Trump because they say, well, he's a businessman. He'll change things. He doesn't seem to be doing anything major different. Now, there are some differences. But, if you're a businessman, you don't go and destroy a prospective customer.
Right.
You don't fight. You don't fight to increase your sphere of influence. You make people come to you because you have something to offer them. And it seems like he is not carrying through on any basic business principle at all. In fact, he seems to be as bad, if not worse, than our predecessors.
No, I think he's been very good for the military-industrial complex. Yeah. If you look at the weapons sales over the last 6 months, look what we just did with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Giving them a multi-billion-dollar deal. These are the kinds of things that happen when we have these threats, or what I call perceived threats. If you don't have them, Congress is not going to spend the money on the technology and the military weapon systems to keep this thing going. Now, there are some threats that are serious and they're legit. We do have to focus on certain things. You know, you can look around and you can say, well, the threat from Islamic State, I would argue, is valid. That is a legitimate threat. I would argue that the threat from Al-Qaeda Arabian Peninsula in Yemen is a valid threat. And I would even argue that the Russian cyber hacking is a valid threat. But again, it's how do we look at that threat? How do we assess it? And do we come up with common sense principles and themes when it comes to our foreign policy? And today, I'm not seeing anything that's different or a new type of thinking from the administration.
You know, Trump, prior to being president, he used to tweet saying, we have no business going into Syria. Syria is not our problem. Obama should divorce himself from Syria. We should provide aid to that part of the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And I said, wow, the guy's got a half a brain cell working. What do you know? He gets into office, he does exactly the opposite. And my problem with Trump, and we're going to get a little bit off the subject for a minute, but my problem with Trump is that I don't understand where he's coming from. I mean, I know some people who have a certain philosophical base, a certain platform from which they make their decisions, and I can understand. I may not agree with them, but I can understand where they're coming from and what their logic is, even though I think it's illogical. When it comes to Trump, sometimes he's red, sometimes he's blue, sometimes he's yellow, sometimes he's green. I have no idea if he has any principles at all to abide by.
I agree with you. I don't think that he does either. I don't think he's thought through a lot of these foreign policy issues, particularly Syria. When you look at Syria, I think you and I had a very, very mild debate, either our second or third show together, when I suggested that we should have some special operators there, but only focused against Islamic State. Forget about Bashar al-Assad, forget about anything else. The problem is when you look out on President Trump's foreign policy, you don't see a coherent strategy.
Right.
You don't see it articulated and you don't see it written down. As far as I know, unless I've missed something, and I don't think I have, there is no Trump doctrine on foreign policy. We don't know what his priorities are. We don't know how he wants to resolve conflict and use his elements of national power. But as of right now, it just seems everything is the military. And, we're starting to see this escalation in Syria. I agree again, we disagreed a little bit. I agree with the use of special operators to support the Syrian Democratic Forces that are focused solely on the Islamic State. But when Trump comes out and Secretary Tillerson comes out and says, well, we've also got to get rid of this guy, Bashar al-Assad, because he's a bad guy. Now, I agree, Bashar al-Assad's a bad guy, but it's not our problem. That's not our fight. That's not our mission.
Right.
It's not something that we need to send military forces in to accomplish. Let's solve the Islamic State problem and let the Syrian people figure out Syria. It's not for us to decide.
Wouldn't we be a relatively wealthy nation if we weren't consistently at war?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I totally agree with that. We've made a lot of strides with China. We're making a lot of strides with India. But there are so many places that we could trade with or get better deals if we would just stop deploying all these military forces around the world. I agree with you 100%.
There used to be an old saying, if we trade goods, we don't trade bullets. Doesn't that still apply today?
Absolutely. It sure does. It's something that I wish our State Department would do more of. As you know, President Trump has proposed a cut to the State Department by 25%. I don't know if that'll go through when the budget comes in, but that's a serious mistake. We've got to use diplomacy and the State Department as our priority and our first objective when dealing with these foreign threats, not the Department of Defense, or as what you like to call the Department of Offense.
Right. Thank you. You remember. I
remember,
feel honored that you remembered.
I remember, Joe.
Most people that I speak with, they say, well, we have to be there because if we're not there, these extreme Islamic terrorists will come here. I said, well, they can come here anyway. I mean, the armies are not coming here. Individuals are coming here. I said, but aren't we creating the hatred by going there? How come they're not going to Ireland or Iceland or Norway or New Zealand or Chile or Argentina? How come they're not going there and bombing the hell out of them, Well, but they never have an answer to that. They said, no, we have to be there. Well, what if we left them alone? why would they come here? For what reason? To cause problems? I mean...
Yeah. Well, I mean, the problem there is that, to some extent, I agree with your premise. But this is where, again, I differ with you just a tiny bit, Joe. The problem that I see is if you leave organizations like the Islamic State or organizations like Al-Qaeda alone, the problem is that they then have a base. That base can then be used for their propaganda and recruiting operations. That base can be used as a place where they plan and execute operations. So, if you look back at what happened prior to 9/11, Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden had a sanctuary. We really weren't giving that a lot of effort either during the Bill Clinton days or in the early days of President Bush. And look what happened on 9/11. You had a terror group that was left alone for the most part, who were able to plan, recruit operations in places like Africa, the Middle East, and then unfortunately for us in the United States. So there's some truth to what you're saying, but I think though that you have to use some limited military force like special operators to go after specific targets. The problem though, Joe, is, and I think what you're referring to is that our missions continue to change. We want to go in and we want to kill terrorists, then we want to change the government. Then we want to do, regime change. And then we want to institute democracy, and we do that using military forces. That's where the problem comes in. Yeah. But I don't necessarily agree that they should be left alone. I agree that over time, some may not be as motivated to do things if we're not attacking them, because we've also had a conversation, I believe it was the second time, when we kill innocent civilians, that's motivation for them to come after us. That's true. I mean, that's the nature of war. That's the nature of this business. But I don't think you can leave them completely alone. I don't support conventional ground forces to do that, but I do support very limited special operators and intelligence capabilities to do that.
Well, isn't it basically human nature, if you did leave them alone, that these groups are not homogeneous. They tend to splinter. So then you have, regardless of what group it is, it could be any group in the world, you have those that want to go left and those that want to go right. I mean, and I take that however you want. But there's difference of opinion. And typically, you'll find that the first thing they do is they fight among themselves. And they splinter themselves. And the more you leave them alone, the more they segregate into separate groups. And you may have one group that looks to be ominous and maybe very dangerous, and if you left them alone, they may wind up with 4 or 5 different groups all fighting. They're too busy fighting themselves for control to worry about going over to some other country.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly examples of that. I think you're right. I think, but on the flip side, you can look at what happened to, say, the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany, about 30 years ago. You can take a look at the IRA. But, when you look at things in the last, say, 15 to 20 years, you didn't have the splinter groups of Al-Qaeda occur until after we went after Al-Qaeda, after that 9/11 attack. So I think you're correct. There are some examples that you can give where that fraction does naturally occur, and we've seen that in the past. But I think if you look at the last 20 or 30 years, you didn't start to see Al-Qaeda affiliates come up until when? Until we actually went into Afghanistan and attacked them. You didn't start to see Islamic State affiliates pop up until we started to aggressively go after them in 2014. So I think there's there's certainly examples of that, but I don't think you can turn away from them, though, and let them grow and recruit. So,
all right, now we consider ourselves the world's policemen, whatever that's supposed to mean. I love that. I love that. When people say that, I can't speak because I become speechless. Believe it or not.
Yeah.
I said, it just doesn't make any sense. But it's because we're such a wealthy nation, but yet, if you look at our total debt and unfunded debt, we are talking close to $250 billion. I mean, many economists say we can pop any time. It could happen tomorrow. It can happen 10 years from now. No one knows that there will be the old snowflake theory. It takes that one last snowflake to last on the side of a mountain, and the whole avalanche comes down on you.
Yeah.
But we are at that point where, the snow is piling up on the side of a mountain, and it's snowing out. We don't know when it's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. We don't know when. Could be tomorrow, could be 10 years from now. But when it happens and we admit that we have been bankrupt for the past 10 years and we kept on spending money like drunken sailors, what's going to happen? We're going to have to do what England did, to withdraw all their troops, no longer become the world empire, dry dock all the aircraft carriers because they're incredibly expensive, as you know better than I do. So all of that, then what happens when we don't have enough money to send troops over there because we don't have enough money to run the United States in and of itself? Well, then we're going to be forced to do what I am suggesting, is to stay home and mind our own business altogether because we're bankrupt. We can't afford it anymore. So that's what I understand.
Absolutely. I mean, you are absolutely right on that. I mean, there's so many places right now that we could probably withdraw. I mean, we can start with Germany, we can start with Japan, we can start with South Korea, and we can continue to go on from there. But you said something very interesting a couple minutes ago. You talked about the world's policemen. It also frustrates me to no end when I hear people talk about that's our role. We have to, patrol the world. We have to be the world's policeman. Well, the reason why a lot of people think that is because they have a fundamental misunderstanding of the world. They think in terms of Cold War. When I talk to some colleagues or when I talk to some other professionals, and I propose the idea, well, what do you think would happen if we left from South Korea? And the first thing that most of these men and women tell me is, well, the Chinese are going to be happy because the North Koreans will take over Seoul, and the Chinese will have a bigger buffer on its border from the United States. Now, that's what a lot of people will tell you, because that's what the books tell them. That's misguided policy. That's based on a Cold War strategy where you have the United States and democracy going after then the Soviet Union and now communist China. And so you're absolutely fundamentally correct, 100%, that the vast majority of our military forces should be coming home. I wouldn't subscribe to do it all at once, but a phased return back to the United States over, say, about a 10-15 year period, because you got to have a place for them to come back. Is absolutely correct, and it's the right line of thinking, Joe.
Yeah. Well, we saw what happened to the Soviet Union when it collapsed. Soldiers in Eastern Europe were selling their uniforms for food. I mean, because they had no more money. We are the Soviet Union today. We are the Soviet Union, and but yet don't the people in Congress, the brilliant neocons, understand that we don't have the money? They know it. They see the budget. In fact, they haven't even passed the budget yet. I mean, they can't agree on that.
We just believe that we have unlimited money. We believe that we can just continue to borrow money, which comes mostly from overseas, like the Chinese. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I do know that we're running out of money. And these foreign entanglements, these foreign operations are just not sustainable in the long run. And until Congress wisens up and tightens its belts, so to speak, nothing's going to change. Because you're right, there's a mentality that they think they can just spend it whatever they want.
All right, give us your projection. What is your projection for the future, let's say the next 5 years or so?
Well, unfortunately, I think what's going to happen over the next 5 years is we're going to continue to be mired in a lot of these foreign entanglements. I don't see anything substantive coming from President Trump or Congress right now to indicate a change in that. President Trump has recently talked about expanding the mission in Afghanistan by anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 troops. I think that's a mistake. I think it's time for us to go home from Afghanistan, but it looks like he's going to keep us there for a while. It looks like the fight in Iraq against the Islamic State has come to a close at this point with the loss of Mosul. But I think what's going to happen is he's going to redeploy a lot of those special operators into Syria. I think the United States is going to continue to increase its military defense capabilities because of a misguided perception of threats against China, threats from Russia, And I don't see clarity over the next 5 years. And I'm basing that solely on what I'm hearing and, most importantly, what I'm reading from members of Congress in their own words and what the president is saying. I wish I could be more optimistic. I wish I could say, I think we're going to start bringing some soldiers home. I don't think it's going to happen. Not under this administration. Just not.
Well, who are these clowns? I say clowns, and I shouldn't say that. You know why? Because I like clowns.
I like clowns too.
I like clowns. That's being very disrespectful to clowns, because I have absolute zero respect for the people in Washington, D.C. Zero.
Yeah.
What galls me is that if you're in the Beltway, everything is a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Everything. You go one block away from the Beltway, and you have abject poverty. Shouldn't that tell us something?
Absolutely.
But when this whole system collapses, what do you think these clowns are going to say? Who are they going to blame? Shouldn't they be blaming themselves? I mean, they think they're so damn smart, but yet they can't look at a balance sheet, a profit and loss statement saying we're broke, we're losing money, we're printing money like crazy, and bond yields are going to go through the roof, and we're not going to give 2 or 3 years from now, our entire revenue will go to paying nothing but interest on the debt. We are finished. They know that, but I think they're collecting as much money as they can, and they're getting out of Dodge, and you and I are going to be left holding the bag.
I don't disagree with you on that, Joe, either. I'm very, very disappointed right now. I mean, I really don't talk a lot of politics. I've tried, as a former intelligence officer and now as a professor, I always try to be independent, right down the middle, look at both sides before I make an intelligent decision. But I have to agree with you on that. I'm very frustrated. I'm disillusioned. I mean, I think there are people who know that there are significant challenges and problems that have to be fixed. I think that the vast majority of the Republican Party would admit that we don't need as many military forces overseas if they were just honest. And it's just very difficult, and I just don't see any end in sight with this nonsense. But I agree with you. I guess I'll just leave it at that. I'm very frustrated as well.
Well, the one question I wanted to ask you up front, and I forgot, but I'm glad I remembered. My Alzheimer's has not taken 100%.
No Alzheimer's.
Yes.
You don't have. You're a sharp guy, Joe. Don't let anybody tell
I don't know how sharp I am sometimes. I think a lot of people want to bury me, but that's another story. But what is the attitude of your students? What's their mentality? And my father used to talk. My father's from the old country. He died many years ago, and he passed away. And the hardworking man came here with nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. He worked at a Polish piano factory, and they used to beat the hell out of him every night. I mean, I tell you, it's a classic immigrant story, And he eventually started his own business, and he became successful. I mean, and he still didn't speak English, but when he passed away, he could hardly understand him. We used to yes him to death. But my father used to talk about people's mentality. Everything, he says, you got the wrong mentality. And we used to tease him when we were young, oh, I got the wrong mentality. But he was right, he's always right, What is the mentality of the students today?
Well, I will tell you, I teach a lot of students here, and I've taught probably a couple thousand at this point over the last few years. I will tell you that it's pretty evenly mixed when you think about a typical student. There's that right wing, side to some students who are very aggressive. They want to go in the military. They want to use military force. They want to do good things, but they're a little bit misguided. Then you have a whole nother set of students which I enjoy as equally as well, and that is, and they're just like, we don't want to go overseas. We've had too much stuff going on. We've got to fix America. So what I've enjoyed is the type of students that I've been fortunate enough to teach over the years have been a good mix. There was actually one class though about 3 years ago where after about 2 or 3 lectures and a lot of discussions, because I ask a lot of questions, where it seemed like the group was very conservative and pro-military, and I never try to change my students' minds. All I try to do is ask them, define the problem. What's causing the problem? What's the real problem? Right. Don't tell me what you think it is. What is the problem, and how do you think you can solve it? But for the most part, they're it's all sides. Some no war, some are we need to go to war and take out North Korea. But what I find interesting and what I take a lot of pride in as a professor is I don't share my political views in class, nor do I suggest that they adopt a certain view. I give them both sides. We oftentimes don't use American media, when we're talking about things like Yemen or North Korea or China. We use source documents that's translated, and that allows them to really make a decision independent of any influence of politics or the professor, because I know it's very common in academia where professors are liberal and they try to instill their values and ideology on students, and I can guarantee you all thousands of my students would tell you that I don't do that. So, but yeah, there's just a broad spectrum.
Well, I'd love for you to sit in your class. And in fact, if you
welcome anytime, Joe.
If you ever need a lunatic to speak to your students, I'm always available. Okay,
Joe, we can make that work if you'd like to come to Charleston, South Carolina for a while.
Oh, I'd love to.
I'd be honored to have you in the class.
Okay, all right. We have about 1 minute left, so let me give that 1 minute for you to close things out and tell our listeners, how they may reach you if you want them to reach you or whatever.
Well, listen, thanks a lot, Joe. Again, it was an honor to be here with you. I absolutely love talking to you. For those in your audience who don't know, not only am I a professor, but I'm also an author. My first book, Into the Shadows, The Fever, will come out in September. It's a spy novel. And my website is michaelbradybooks.com. That's michaelbradybooks.com. They can sign up for a monthly newsletter. They're not going to get bombarded with buy my book, I promise. They're actually going to get articles that I write for Asia Times. And current events going on in the intelligence community. But I'd be honored if they looked at michaelbradybooks.com. And again, Joe, it was an honor talking to you. You're a good man. You're a wise man. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Oh, thank you so much. And I hope you do accept that invitation to return at a later date.
Absolutely. You got it.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, Michael.
All right. Thank you so much, Joe.
Right. Folks, this is the end of today's broadcast. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support, and we'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends, and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. Remember, as my wife would say, you're either allowing your liberties to be taken away or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Stay well. Stay tuned.